All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into one of the weirdest, most fragile partnerships in all of history, the Grand Alliance of World War II. We're going to break down exactly why this whole thing fell apart and how that collapse basically set the stage for the Cold War and decades of mistrust between the East and West.
So let's jump right in with this fantastic quote from the historian Odd Arne Westad. He calls the alliance a set of shotgun marriages, and that really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? This wasn't a partnership built on friendship or common values. Nope, it was a partnership of pure necessity, forged in total desperation. It was never, ever meant to last.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at just how strange this alliance really was. Then, we'll dive into the clash of their core beliefs, the leaders' totally different goals, the clashing personalities at the top, and finally, how it all inevitably fell apart.
All right, part one, a strange alliance. To really get why there was so much mistrust after the war, you first have to realize just how bonkers this whole Grand Alliance was from day one.
Just look at this trio. You've got the United States, the richest capitalist nation on Earth. Then there's the Soviet Union, the world's first and only communist country. And to round it out, Great Britain, the biggest colonial empire the world had ever seen. The leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, they were only united by one thing, and I mean one thing, taking down Hitler. Everything else, they were totally at odds. They were rivals, through and through.
Okay, so that brings us to the real heart of the problem. A massive clash of ideologies. We're not talking about a simple political disagreement here. This was a fundamental, down-to-the-bone conflict about the right way to run a country, to organize a society. And this really lays it all out, side by side. You've got the West with its ideals of democracy, personal freedom, free elections, and a market economy. And then you've got the Soviet model, a single-party state with total control and a state-run economy. The key thing to understand here is that these two systems weren't just different. They were completely incompatible. They literally couldn't coexist peacefully in the long run, because each one saw the other as a direct threat to its very existence.
And wow, this quote from Churchill just perfectly sums up that hostility. He says, "Never forget that Bolsheviks are crocodiles." He's not just talking politics here. This is a gut-level, deep-seated hatred of communism that was always just bubbling beneath the surface of the alliance. In his mind, they were crocodiles, predators. You could work with them, sure, but you could never, ever trust them or turn your back.
So this ideological chasm gets even wider when you look at what the leaders actually wanted to achieve after the war. They weren't fighting for the same future, not even close. Each of the big three was fighting for a world that would benefit their nation, their system.
So let's start with Roosevelt, the American president. He had this grand vision for a brand new world order, really, built on American ideals. He wanted self-determination for every country, a new United Nations to keep the peace, and a rebuilt democratic Germany at the heart of Europe. He absolutely hated the old European way of doing things, the whole game of empires and carving up the world into spheres of influence. Churchill, though, he was the exact opposite. He was a man of that old world through and through. His number one goal was keeping the British Empire intact, whatever it took. He was all about that balance of power diplomacy. Basically, the idea that you keep the peace by carving up the map into spheres of influence. In fact, he even cut a secret deal with Stalin, the infamous percentages agreement, to do just that in Eastern Europe.
And then you have Stalin. His main goal was brutally, brutally simple, and it came from one place: fear. The Soviet Union had been invaded by Germany twice in just 30 years. So for Stalin, it was all about security. He was dead set on creating a buffer zone of friendly, Soviet-controlled countries in Eastern Europe to make sure that could never, ever happen again. Nothing else mattered as much as the physical safety of the USSR.
So here's the bottom line. When these three guys looked at the map of Europe after the war, they saw three totally different, totally incompatible futures. What was self-determination to Roosevelt was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Soviet Union for Stalin. What was a practical sphere of influence for Churchill was just dirty old world imperialism to Roosevelt. There was just no common ground, zero.
Okay, but it wasn't just about grand strategy, right? You also have to factor in the human element, the actual personalities of these leaders, their backgrounds, their gut feelings, their personal styles. All of that played a huge role in how this alliance worked and why it eventually failed. This quote from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin is just perfect. He says Roosevelt was a child of the 20th century and the New World, while Churchill was a European of the 19th century. Think about that. He's saying Roosevelt was this forward-looking idealist, while Churchill was stuck in the past, worried about old power games and his precious empire. It's like they were operating in two different centuries. And look at how they saw each other. It's fascinating. Churchill looked at Stalin and saw this deep, cool wisdom. Truman, who came later, called him honest but smart as hell. But what about from the Soviet side? Well, their foreign minister, Molotov, he looked at Roosevelt and basically thought all that talk about ideals was just a trick. He believed FDR thought America's money could just buy the Soviet Union's loyalty. So this wasn't a relationship built on trust, not at all. It was all about suspicion and calculation.
Okay, so let's get to the end game. How did this incredibly fragile partnership finally just shatter?
Well, one of the biggest triggers was Roosevelt's sudden death in April 1945. The guy who replaced him, Harry Truman, was a whole different animal. Roosevelt was a smooth diplomat, a relationship builder. Truman? He was blunt. He was direct. He wasn't a diplomat, and he didn't pretend to be. And that confrontational style immediately, and I mean immediately, changed the entire vibe with the Soviets. And ultimately, this is what it all boils down to. When Nazi Germany was finally defeated in May 1945, that wasn't a moment for the Allies to celebrate together. It was the moment the only thing holding them together disappeared. The common enemy was gone. And the second that happened, all that mistrust, all that ideological hatred, all those competing plans for the future, it all came roaring back. You know, this whole story brings up a classic debate in history, something called the great man theory. And it really just asks a simple question. Do powerful individuals shape history, or are they just swept along by bigger forces they can't control?
So as we wrap this up, that's the big question I want to leave you with. Was the Cold War just inevitable? Was it a collision of two systems, capitalism and communism, that were always destined to clash, no matter who was in charge? Or was it more personal? Was it forged by the specific fears, the ambitions, the personalities of these three men, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin? If different people had been in that room, could history have turned out differently? That's really the question you have to wrestle with to understand how the Cold War began.